Shalom. Call halal Yahweh Vashalam Shai by Hashem Rakar Kwadash. Double honors unto the apostles, double honors unto the elder bishops, salutations to all my fellow laborers doing this work in truth and sincerity, risking their lives and their freedom to do so now more so than ever. To the scattered elect that are scattered around the four corners of the earth, that be like unto the speckled bird among the heathens, that look like the heathens. And to the Akwaf that are listening and learning, to you I say Shalom. This is your brother Malcolm, coming back at you with the part 2 of Black Codes and the Indian slave trade. And I hadn't even noticed that the book up in the far right corner is called Watermelons, Nooses, and Straight Razors. All right, from the Jim Crow Museum. I can only imagine the oppressive cruelties, inhumane treatment of Christians, of whites, of so-called self-proclaimed white Christians that were done to so-called blacks in that book. But we're going to continue in this book. Then we're going to jump into the Indian slave trade, just to prove some of the lies that have been propagated by Esau, Edom, the so-called white man. And we're on page 2 in the Black Codes, and it says, we read child legitimate. So this is a definition of slaves. A slave is one over whose person's liberty, labor, and property another has legal control. Presumption of slavery. All Negroes and mulattoes are deemed and hereby declared to be prima facie slaves, and it rests upon those alleging freedom to prove it. So when you're seen, if you're seen in the South, not just in Georgia, but in the South, and you are a so-called, black or so-called mulatto, mazitos, whatever they call it, person of color, you are presumed prima facie. You're a slave until you prove otherwise. All right, if you happen to have lost your papers or misplaced them, then oh well. Mulatto is one in whose veins there is at least 1/8 Negro blood. All right. All slaves and shadow personnel. All right, and this is shadows. This is the definition of it. All slaves are shadow personnel, and to be governed by the same laws, except in cases of expressly provided by statute, or where the nature of property requires modification of the ordinary rules. So they leave it open to interpretation so they can change the game as they go along. Typical of Esau, Edom, the so-called white man. Natural rights. The laws of nature guarantee to every man the right to his life and his limbs, unless forfeited for crime. The state of slavery debars no one of this right. So, yeah, right. Dominion of third persons. While the slave is in dominion of his master, third persons have no right or dominion over him, further than the law that gives such right as for police purposes. Acquisition of slaves. A slave cannot acquire or hold property. All acquisitions belong to his masters. Gifts to him accompanied by delivery accrue to the benefit of the master. Without delivery, they cannot be enforced by law. So if a slave was gifted anything, it automatically belonged to the master. All right. Property of a slave. All property held by the slave with consent of the master is subject to the will of the master at any time. All right, let's grab a scripture for that set of Black Code laws. Let's grab a scripture. This is Psalms 94:20. And it reads, shall the throne of iniquity have fellowship with thee, which frameth mischief by law? So they make these mischievous, wicked deeds and write them into law to benefit them and their kind, and to oppress with much wicked oppression. It's like it says in 2nd Ezra, Are thou not them that was made to rule in my kingdom with much wicked oppression and deceit? All right, let us continue. Page 3. Article 2. Children follow the mother. The children of all female slaves shall follow the condition of their mother and shall belong to the person holding the title of the mother at the time of their birth. All right. So I got a scripture. I'm going to go to it right away before I go any further. Because it's, the status of a person comes through their father. So, like I said, that law was written because that allowed the so-called, even though he wrote laws that they couldn't intermarry with women of color, all right, which was a persona non grata, whether you were black, Asian, or so-called native, all right. That basically they put that child in a something referred to as a bastard status, because that child had no rights, and that child didn't. But it was like the father he made this child, but it was he had nothing to do with it, and so the child really inherited his mother. So if the mother was a persona non grata, so was the father. So was the child, even though his father was a so-called white man. So once again, for you BOIs, you black only Israelites, especially if you were an attractive black woman, all right, you didn't survive not being raped, and the chances of you having multiple children with white men, either intentionally or non-intentionally, was very likely. More than half the black population of women gave birth to brown-skinned babies that look like Negroes that are actually Edomites. A topic that they do not like to talk about or discuss, as they, scream there, if you're not black, you're not an Israelite. That madness. All right? Because the condition of a child was that of his father. This is Exodus 1:5. And it reads, "And the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was already in Egypt." Was in Egypt already. All right? So what that literally means is that all the children, the 12 tribes that came out of the 12 sons that formulate the 12 tribes and the one daughter, they all came out of Jacob. Their mothers did not determine their nationality. You have to remember the 12 tribes of Israel came out of 4 different women that were not Israelites. Jacob was the Israelite. Jacob was the seed of Abraham and Isaac. And his name was changed to Israel. So all his sons and then his sons' descendants became the Israelites. All right. Their mothers are not even mentioned after that, because their mothers had nothing to do with their race, with their heritage. Absolutely nothing. All right. Because the woman doesn't continue the line of her father. The son continues the line of the father. It's really simple. All right. It's a very simple thing. Push this door back up. The dog came to visit me and open the door. All right. Who are free persons of color? This is page 3 still in Article 2. Who are free persons of color? Free persons of color are either emancipated slaves or their descendants, such persons as shall have at least 1/8 Negro blood in their veins. Rights of free persons of color. The free person of color is entitled to no right of citizenship except such as specifically or specially given by the law. His status differs from that of a slave in this: no master having dominion over him, he is entitled to the free use of liberty, labor, and property, except so far as he is restrained by law. So we see how the laws prevented them from owning and buying and having fair trade and it's all oh wow, man. Because it tells you back here that they couldn't own property, they couldn't vote, they couldn't do anything. So what is he free to do except for make himself an indentured service and go right back into slavery and be a sharecropper or something like that? They really had Jake jammed up, man. It says included in slave laws, all laws enacted in reference to slaves and their nature applicable to free persons of color shall be construed to include them unless specially accepted. So there's clauses in every law that they wrote and amendment status in every law that they wrote so that they can adjust them accordingly as they went along. It's like playing a game with the 5-year-old, with the 6-year-old. How the rules keep changing as they go along. Insurrection. Insurrection shall consist in any combined resistance to lawful authority of the master of the state with intent to the permanent denial thereof when the same be manifested or intended to be manifested by acts of violence, the mere resistance of a slave or his attempt to escape or actual escape from the master shall not constitute insurrection. All right, so how could you expect someone not to be in any sensible person to go through these things and then not be ready to act in an insurrection act to set themselves free or even get revenge? All right. Now I'm into the book The Indian Slave Trade, which is by Alain Gallay. And I'm going to read some of pages 297 and 298. All right, we're going to get to the bottom of this whole and when they created this lie, which you are, that you inherited your mother's condition, meaning it gave them the freedom to, for pale males to just rape, rob, and then have nothing done to them because they will rape a woman who's married already, all right, or underage girl, so to speak, and there was no law to convict them because you were a persona non grata. And then the child that was born of that just became another slave to add to for their profit, when in fact it was their own child of their own race, even if it didn't look like them. All right, because you remember you're whatever your father is. So this just goes to show you, like the scripture said, how can you expect somebody to do good that does evil to themselves, man? To make children and then it's one thing to make children and just completely leave them in a persona non grata, but then to make children and then purposely allow them to be put into this horrendous slavery situation. All right, but this is page 297. Contours of the Indian slave trade. It says, after 1702, large armies made 3 major attacks on the Choctaw in 1706, 1708, and 1711 to obtain slaves. Bernard de la Hopte, so the natives of the Americas, the Native Americans also went into slaves on the chattel slavery and were reclassified as black, put on reservations and or put on ships and sent in the reverse slave trade to Europe. The slave ships were not leaving America. They weren't just dumping off the so-called Negroes, in the Americas and then leaving empty. They were going back to Europe full of so-called natives or so-called Hispanics. All right. To obtain slaves, Bernard de la Harpe reported that the Chickasaw and the English carried off 300 Choctaw women and children in the 1706 raid. Details of the 1708 are not murkier. All right, murkier. So they didn't keep the records from the 1708 one. A major English excursion that had planned for that year was scratched, substituted by 2 invasions of Indians with minor English participation. One of these armies went against the Indians who lived in the environs of Mobile. The other force was led by Thomas Welch and thus probably comprised Chickasaw, but might have also included Creek. How many Choctaw were captured is unknown, but Welch complained in December of 1708 that Governor Johnson had confiscated 15 Choctaw slaves, and he and others had taken. The invasion of 1711, discussed at the beginning of the chapter, yielded 330 slaves. If added Iberville's numbers, the Choctaw taken before 1702, the numbers carried off in 1706 and 1711, the Choctaw totals reached over 1,000, or 1,130. When the unknown number was carried off in 1708, the number carried off the raids in 1708, 1750 were also added. It is reasonable to conclude that between 15 to 200,000 Choctaw were enslaved. Many Tuscarora and allies of the Northern Carolina were sold into slavery. All right, so they would ally you, just like I said. As you see on the screen, they would align themselves with certain tribes, promising, lands of the tribe that they were warned against and things of that nation. And then after they would conquer, a particular people, they would sell them to slavery. Then they would turn on the people that they just fought with and do the same to them. So the Northern Kingdom were, in some cases, selling their own people into slavery, selling runaway Negroes into slavery. Yes, that did happen. Negroes, some of these free Negroes were also slave owners and slave traders too, especially the Moors. I always tell you, the Moors were some of the biggest race traders that ever existed, because a lot of them did participate in the slave trade from its beginnings against their own people. All right. But this still was orchestrated by Esau Edom, the so-called white man. It doesn't negate what they did. All right. Says many Tuscarora and their allies of North Carolina were also sold into slavery. Enslavement had been one of the causes of the outbreak of war, but there was no way of exacting how many were enslaved. John Bernal admitted to having taken 36 captives on this expedition, but that does not include those taken by the Indian allies. See, Governor Pollock thought that Barnwell and his forces took 200 women and children on the second expedition into North Carolina. James Moore was specific about Indian casualties. He reported to have taken 392 prisoners, 192 scalps. These pieces of shit. He thought that at least another 200 were killed and burned inside their fort, and 166 others were killed and taken that had fled the fort. All right, and then on page 299, there's a whole breakdown of all these slaves that were taken. It says Florida, 15 to 20,000, high range 30,000. Arkansas, they don't even know. Arkansas to Tanza to Tanika, 1,000 to 2,000. Lower Mississippi Valley, these are all so-called natives, 1,000 to 3,000. Choctaw, 2,000 to 2,500. Tuscarora allies, 1,200 to 2,000. Westo, 15,000. Subtotal 41,000. And then it said Piedmont Creek, Savannah, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Makana, Gwali, and others over 10,000. So subtotal about 51,000, and and they're lying. It was way more than that. All right. It says Charlestown, as Peter H. Wood incisively shows, what Ellis Island for Africans arriving in the New World, but also marked a point of deportations for thousands of Native Americans. What did I tell you? All right, they were bringing in so-called Negroes, and on the same ships, they were loading them up with natives and selling them and sending them back overseas. All right, it says there is little record of where large numbers of enemy Indians were shipped, and the sole extant official Carolina document exports for the period, which covers the year of June 1712 to 1713, lists only 75 slaves exported. Moreover, more contemporaries listed in the West Indies, all right, For instance, Barbados was most likely destination for Indian slaves because the South Carolinas conducted extensive slave trade there in the first decades, but many surviving Barbadian shipments returned list only outbound goods. So they weren't keeping records of it, okay? Now, on page 302, it tells you it is impossible to determine how many Indians were shipped northward. New York and Pennsylvania's extent shipping returns do not begin until 1713. So they weren't even keeping records until 1713. They have been sending natives into slavery the whole time. All right. And why? Because you got to remember in 1683, the Negro and the so-called native were considered the same people and were both called niggers. All right. And they looked alike. One just had wavier hair than the other for the most part. All right. But then they intermixed and intermarried as well. All right. But it says we also run into the same problem of custom agents not reporting or reporting accurately the import of Indian slaves. For instance, in 1715, the Royal Anne arrived in New York with a shipment of Indians and black slaves. A number of blacks were recorded, but not the number of Indians. So they were not reporting Gad and Reuben as they were taking them into slavery. All right, and this whole slave process thing with the so-called white man. Here, I'm going to read this right here. This is on page 46. And it reads at the bottom paragraph, English rationale for enslavement lay in the belief that captives taken in just war, they call it a just war, the rape, robbery, murder was just to the so-called white man, could be offered because, hey, look, we keep telling you, that's why you're watching America fall now. All right, because slavery is the next stop for you so-called white people. All right, everything you did is going to come back on you double. Manifest Destiny had a part 2. You didn't read the fine print. You should have read the Bible a little bit more closely. But it says, English rationale for enslavement lay in the belief that captives taken in a just war could be offered enslavement as an alternative to death. The narrowness of the option offered prisoners did not diminish the voluntary nature of the decision, for the captives had an effect fortified their lives when they were captured. So you were captured against your will, but you fortified your life. You hear this shit? Captives considered themselves benevolent by giving captives the choice of enslavement or death. I'm benevolent. Well, I can kill you, or you can have live a hellish servitude to me for the rest of your life, and you're benevolent. All right, let me just jump down to the point. Two oddities characterize this rationale. First, in law, the children's status devolved from the father, not the mother. The change perpetuated enslavement by making the status hereditary, a condition contrary to most African slave traditions, to any slave tradition. Whether it was in Rome, Greece, Germany, in the past times, in times past, in the ancient world, you derive from your father. All right, but this also proves Jeremiah 50 and 33 and the hypocrisy of Esau, Edom, the so-called white man. But this is we read Jeremiah 50 and 33 for these BOIs, right? For their stupidity, all right, their blindness. But Jeremiah 50 and 33 reads, Thus saith Yahweh of hosts, the children of Israel, all right, the so-called Latinos, Native Americans, natives, all right, and the children of Judah, the so-called black people, were oppressed together, and all that took them captives held them fast. They refused to let them go. Call Halal Yahweh Bashem Awashai Bashem Rakak Kodash Shalom Abba Ball.